Hey,
Hey, how are you?
I'm well. How are you? It's great to see you.
I'm good. It's good to see you.
With the same,
How's
your ears seem to have expanded a little bit, but aside from that,
these
like,
things have grown, I've just glued them on because all of life is lived in this space. So,
yeah. Are you guys on lockdown now, like we are?
no, because, this is Arizona, but we should be.
Uh,
I believe we have distinguished ourselves as number one in the world for the second time this year. Number
oh,
one for new infections per day
oh my God.
per capita. So,
Oh, that's crazy.
but chugging along.
And is Tempe in particular hard hit?
No, actually, I mean, ASU has been amazingly good at keeping the lid on things with the university. So, I mean, the immediate surrounding area apparently is so ASU has built its own sort of testing infrastructure, and the university community, the rates are pretty low. That includes the students, and people are back in the dorms and things are in person and so forth.
Things are in
But in
person.
the
They're holding classes in person.
Yeah, I mean, small classes where there's like space to. So, for example, I'm teaching a big class it's about 400. The lecture is online. The discussion sections are hybrid. People can come in person if they want to,
The
and it's
lecture's
in a
online
space where.
in asynchronous fashion. You prepare it by yourself and put it online, and there is.
No, it's synchronous. It's a live lecture,
Uh-huh.
but that's all online. And then the smaller classes, I can't remember what the number is, but it's under 30 or something like that. They have the classroom space to accommodate distance classes. So we're doing some things in person, which it's so far it's working pretty well. I mean, there's been very low rates of infection within the ASU community, but then so the ASU also does sort of free testing for the community, and apparently that the results from those tests are crazy. So the one of my colleagues who runs that was telling me on Friday that the percent positivity from the day before had been 25%,
Oh my God.
which means the prevalence is,
Oh my God. That's
yeah,
astonishing.
anyway,
That's horrifying.
yeah. But maybe the good news is we'll be out of this thing sooner than the
How is
rest of the
the
world.
vaccine distribution going in Arizona?
Yeah, so actually, uh, so it was sort of pretty poor initially, um, and the state took it over and basically built, this is sort of typical for Arizona, this massive drive-through where and of course it's the football stadium. So it's sort of like all things Arizona all packaged into one, but except for the fact that normally those things are pretty poorly organized. And I actually went this morning. So the slot that I could get was 5 a.m. this morning, and I was actually worried about being stuck in line and being late for this, but it actually took me in and out, half an hour with 15
5 in the
minutes of
morning on a
sitting
Sunday
there.
morning.
What's that?
5 in the morning on a Sunday morning, and it still was a half an hour.
Well, I mean, that's fast because you got to wait for 15 minutes, and they're doing it, continuously, 24 hours a day, 10 people every 3 minutes or something like that. So yeah, I mean, it seems to be, of course, the rate limiting thing, I think now, once the things are organized, is going to be the vaccine availability. But how about for you guys? Are you how's Israel handling those things?
It's kind of remarkably, shockingly efficient. I mean, it's fairly clear. It's easy to get. Right now, people 50 and older and healthcare workers and people in old age homes, people who work in old age homes and teachers are all eligible to get it. Next week, that will go down to 40-year-olds and above.
Wow.
And
Wow.
they've vaccinated a bit under 25% of the population so far,
Wow.
which is pretty good. And it's going really, really quickly. And we're paying, I think, somewhere between 4 and 6 times as much as you're paying per vaccine, but it has given us enough, apparently.
That's interesting. I thought they weren't going to make a profit on it. I thought that was the idea, but there's a market after all.
Well, there's a little bit of a market. The United States negotiated with them from the beginning. I mean, it was actually a very smart thing for the United States to do in exchange for support. And so they have they delimited the price, but for foreigners, it can be what it can be. And there is a market, and there is there is competition, but we were apparently like willing to just pay, which is a decision that I'm grateful for. So it seems to be very, very well.
Cool, yeah. Well, anyway, we're nowhere near that, of course, and that's going to take us quite a lot longer than it's taken you. So I guess. Yeah. Well, some benefits to being smaller.
Yes, and we also actually, you might find this interesting. We made our last agreement, or the Prime Minister negotiated the last agreement just a week and a half ago with Pfizer, where he got an extra 4 million doses, 2 million vaccines for in exchange for the money, but also in exchange for handing over all of the data of Israel about the vaccine, which, because we're kind of the leader so far in vaccinating, we're producing a lot of data, and it's all centralized, what's left over from socialized health, and we have this very good single payer system. So all the data is collected, and so it's being randomized and turned over to Pfizer as we go. And that was what persuaded them apparently to prefer us over places like England and France.
So it's basically a massive phase 4 trial.
Yeah, exactly.
Is Israel doing anything unconventional, like spreading out the doses or anything like that? No.
3 weeks between doses, and so far, I mean, those voices have been heard, but so far no one's going for it.
Interesting.
Okay, maybe we'll begin. Oren, are you here? Maybe not.
Yes, I am.
So I don't know if you have announcements that you want to make end of the semester, that kind of thing.
Well, first of all, hello, everyone. Nice to see everyone, and thanks, Ben, for being with us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Basically, as you all know, this is our last colloquium of the semester. It's been a somewhat long semester, punctuated by lockdowns, number of lockdowns, and a lot of staying at home with kids and our parents in their own homes. And I just want to say kol hakavod for everyone that we arrived at this point. I'm quite glad that this is that we're taking a break. I'm sure you guys are too. I feel like we all need it, and we are back. We'll be back for classes on the 7th of March. So it's quite a break. It's about 7 weeks of a break, and I really want to thank everyone, speaking for the entire faculty and program, for being such good sports about arriving in class in our Zoom classrooms, and being patient with the technology and with us bumbling through it, and just sticking to your studies and not losing the spark, and continuing to come week after week, and be so excited and enthusiastic about pursuing knowledge and opening your minds to new ideas. It's just wonderful. We all love you very much, and feel fortunate to have been together for this semester, and very much look forward to the next semester. I think that's about it. Thanks again to Noah.
Well, thank you. That's great, and I will begin by saying just how glad I am that you are here, Ben, and how happy I am that you agreed and that we're ending the semester with you. I'll introduce you by saying that that Ben Hurlbut professes in the School of Life Sciences at ASU, at Arizona State University, which is already in itself an interesting thing that when you have an opportunity, I commend to you to speak with Ben about. He's trained in STS with a focus on the history of modern biomedical and life sciences. And his research, he writes, lies at the intersection of STS, bioethics, and political theory. Ben studies the changing relationships between science, politics, and law in the governance of biomedical research and innovation, examining the interplay of science and technology with democracy, religious and moral pluralism, and public reason. He's the author of a rather mind-blowing book called Experiments in Democracy. It has a subtitle, Human Embryo Research and the Politics of Bioethics. And he's also the co-editor of a book called Perfecting Human Futures, Transhuman Visions and Technological Imaginations, as well as lots of articles and book chapters. His BA, which was an AB, is from Stanford. His PhD is in History of Science at Harvard, and his postdoc was at the program of STS at the Harvard Kennedy School. And there is no short distance longer than the distance between the Science Center on Harvard's campus and the Kennedy School to study STS. So the fact that he managed to traverse those blocks is an astonishment. And Ben was one of the last human beings that I saw in America on my last trip to America last March, just as the corona was really hitting. I actually bailed on a final dinner that we were going to have together so that I could race to the airport a day early to make it home before they closed the airport here, which was a happy way for me to go from that life to this, because Ben is one of the most enchanting and fascinating, challenging, and intellectually exciting people that I've ever had a chance to speak to. So I've had this fantasy that one of the things I'm going to do when this is all over is go back to Tempe and buy Ben a beer, sit back and just remember how great life can be. So Ben, this ain't the same. It don't replace the beer, but I am delighted that you're here. Thank you.
Well, Noah, thank you so much for having me, and I'm going to hold you to that beer. I'll come to you if you don't come to me, because it's right. The dinner that we got cheated out of, it was the first, great violation of the good life by this pandemic that I experienced. So anyway, so hopefully we can make it up in due course. Okay, so thanks so much for having me. Have I got screen sharing privileges?
You want to?
Yes. Okay, good. Let me pop up my slides here. Okay. Okay, so I thought today that I would give a talk that engages with something that's quite contemporary and sort of exciting, even certainly controversial, even salacious to some degree, and try to draw out of it a set of considerations that are by no means specific to this particular case, but I find this case to be a fascinating instance from which to draw it out. So this will be a sort of stories heavy talk, and I hope you enjoy it. Actually, I'm sorry, I clicked the wrong, oops. Forgot to have it show me my notes. Okay, there we go. I still haven't gotten used to this Zoom thing where I have to arrange my audience in relation to my slides and so forth. Okay, so as I'm sure everybody in this Zoom room knows, there has been a debate ongoing for sort of 5 years now, or at least it really got going in the sort of public eye about 5 years ago, a debate about the potential to apply the then still relatively new genome editing tool of CRISPR-Cas9 to human embryos in vitro. In other words, to engineer the human germline. The debate was sort of catalyzed in early 2015 by a rumor, soon after confirmed, that a lab in China was modifying non-viable human embryos to correct a disease-causing gene, that the work was underway. Quickly, leading scientists and scientific academies stepped up into a kind of leadership role in convening and shaping deliberation. They called for the scientific community to take the lead in establishing guidelines for research and innovation, often invoking the precedent of recombinant DNA in the famous 1975 Asilomar meeting. The first major convening was the 2015 International Summit on Human Gene Editing. This is David Baltimore, the former president of Caltech, a Nobel laureate. He opened this 2015 meeting. He also opened 40 years earlier the 1975 Asilomar meeting. In his opening remarks, he made the stakes clear. Quote, "We are taking on a heavy responsibility for our society because we understand that we could be on the cusp of a new era of human history. The actions that we take now will guide us into the future." This discourse of scientific responsibility reflected a confidence in the ability of science, and thus, in a sense, the responsibility of science to govern itself and thereby guide humanity towards a beneficent future, navigating, you might say, the narrow path of progress, thereby avoiding slippery slopes. Interestingly, though, and this is what I want to focus on here, this responsibility discourse unfolded alongside another apparently contradictory one of technological inevitability. So just as the debate was beginning to unfold in 2015, Nature Biotechnology conducted a kind of group interview of prominent scientists and bioethicists, asking a series of questions to capture their views on the sort of state of play. This was the first question. Given the pace of innovation, is germline genetic engineering inevitable? This is the first question in the interview. Most responded that indeed it was inevitable. Robin Lovell Badge, a British developmental biologist who has since played a major role in the debates on human genetic engineering, answered, quote, "It is inevitable and will be carried out somewhere given that it is not illegal in many countries." Jennifer Doudna, who's since been awarded the Nobel Prize for her development of CRISPR-Cas9, said, quote, "It seems inevitable because the basic technology is all in place." So the discourse of inevitability has been widely present in the genome editing debates, right alongside confident assertions that the technology is governable and there's no warrant for worry about slippery slopes and the like. So the question, should it be done, sort of sits right alongside assertions that it will be done. So I'm going to show that that prediction tends to mutate into a prescription. It shall be done. That's one of the main things I want to show here. The prophecies of inevitability were, of course, vindicated a few years later when the world learned that a young, ambitious scientist in China named He Jiankui had produced babies whose genomes had been edited. He was immediately labeled a rogue, a dangerous aberration from scientific norms. Aberrant and yet inevitable. About a month before the news of the babies became public, He had told his former postdoctoral mentor, Stanford biophysicist Stephen Quake, that they had been born. Quake is the co-director of the Chan Zuckerberg Hub, which is a $1 billion initiative to, as it says, to cure all disease. So Quake had advised He, first as his postdoctoral mentor, but as he developed this project, he had sort of been there along the way as an advisor, as he undertook the experiment. It's, of course, hard for people to keep secrets, especially such salacious secrets. So Quake wrote to someone he describes as, quote, "an extremely prominent scientist in the field." Here's what he wrote. "First genome edited baby, done, parentheses, in China, where else?" The scientist's reaction, according to Quake, was, quote, "not terribly surprised, not an oh my God thing, like it's inevitable, like the inevitable has happened." Indeed, that diagnosis was widely shared, yet it was coupled to the notion that technological inevitability made it urgent to reflect on the ethical implications of the technology. But let's ask, what kind of ethics is possible when the future is predetermined? So I want to sort of take up that question and illustrate 4 key points. First, the prophecy of inevitability is self-fulfilling. It in effect naturalizes practices and commitments, which are actually expressions of, let's call it an imaginary of technoscientific progress that posits innovation as the inevitable prime mover. let me note as a kind of a side note, we can come back to this if you want, that this is a dehumanizing imaginary in the sense that it posits a force that occludes the sort of all too human forms of life that produce it, and of course that would seek to contain or govern it. Second, it constructs any ethical response as intrinsically reactive. It's intrinsically reactive because science and technology advance on their own steam, and ethics can in effect only play catch up. As I'll show, this is because the technology has made the focal point of ethical deliberation over what amounts to a yes or no question. Is it ethically acceptable or unacceptable, right? That's the sort of truncated question that gets asked, and yet it gets asked in the frame of inevitability. It's inevitable, whether or not it's acceptable. This underwrites a kind of scientific arrogance, or an arrogation of the authority to declare what's at stake, a kind of grabbing and appropriating of the authority to declare what's at stake, what must be done, and what responsibility entails. So I want to show that arrogation of responsibility comes also in the form of externalizing failure, of marking off the effects of technological progress as deviations from it, even when those deviations are seen as inevitable results of progress. Finally, prophesying what's inevitable is in fact professing to a kind of imaginary of right governance. So the question here is not, is it inevitable or is it not, or is it getting constructed as inevitable when it isn't inevitable? The point is that in declaring it inevitable, a declaration is also being made, a kind of tacit declaration is also being made about how it should be governed and who should govern it. So it's an imaginary of right governance that asserts the right relations between science, technology, and society, and in effect claims to have a monopoly on, you might say, the serenity to accept the things that cannot be changed, the courage to change the things that can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Okay, so much for sort of general framing remarks. I now want to tell a sort of series of stories that illustrate these things. So here are David Baltimore's opening comments from the December 2015 International Summit, the first International Summit. The unthinkable has become conceivable. Sorry, I have to move you guys around here again. Now we must face the questions that arise. How, if at all, do we as a society want to use this capability? So the unthinkable has become conceivable. Now we must face the questions that arise. And note also the we as a society. And if you remember back to what I quoted before, he said, we are taking on a heavy responsibility for society. There's a certain slippage between a more inclusive we and a more exclusive we. But take note that the unthinkable has become conceivable rehearses this pattern from science to technology to society. Knowledge is made, it comes to be applied through technique and technology. When that technology is sort of on the threshold of or beginning to make its way out into society, that's when questions arise. That's when we have to confront those questions. So it's sort of at this second arrow. This is, of course, the linear model. And you know, as anybody who's been hanging around in the world of STS knows, there's been a very large literature that has, in effect, debunked the story of the linear model as an account of innovation. But if we read this not as an account of innovation, but as an account of governance, we see that that story actually is a regulative story. It plays a quite profound role in structuring the ways in which the relationships between these three entities, if you think of these as sort of institutional entities, as jurisdictions, it structures the relationships between them. So the questions that obtain at this second arrow that demand reaction are questions that should only come up at this second arrow, in effect. It's a strange claim because, of course, the questions that are at stake now that we now must face are old, are very old, actually. This is from a letter to the Carter administration from three religious organizations in 1980 that was precipitated by advances in recombinant DNA in the 1970s, the advent of human in vitro fertilization in 1978, and very importantly, the Diamond v. Chakrabarty decision by the US Supreme Court that allowed property ownership of biologically engineered organisms. And these religious figures saw this confluence as warranting concern and anticipated, quote, a new era of fundamental danger triggered by the rapid growth of genetic engineering, which raises the question of the fundamental nature of human life and the dignity and worth of the individual human being. Quite expansive ethical questions. And yet, these questions were, and I can say more about this if you want. Sorry, my dog is, get out of here, doggy. But these were quick, these sort of quite expansive questions were quickly sort of drawn down into questions of technical feasibility and of safety. And in effect, there was a judgment that because you can't really do this, or you certainly can't do this safely, it need not be discussed. And so the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, which sort of had functioned as having a kind of gatekeeping control over this kind of research, at least federally funded research, declared in the mid-1980s that it will not at present entertain proposals for germline alterations. And that was that. And this in effect remains in effect, or it remained in effect until the recent dissolution, essentially functionally dissolution of the RAC. So this functioned as a prohibition, but also more importantly as a kind of a conversation stopper. The science and the technology aren't there yet. We're not at the second arrow, therefore no need to speak about it. It also, though, in effect, underwrote the reversal of that prohibition. So this is a kind of provocative headline that summarizes the conclusions of a National Academy's report on sort of ethics, science ethics and governance related to human genome editing from issued in February 2017, in which they in effect endorse, pending demonstrations of safety, in effect endorse uses of genome editing to alter the human germline. Here's an explanation by one of the co-chairs of that committee about where this reversal came from. Well, there's been a line drawn by many that says you should refrain. That's the categorical prohibition. But that was mostly because there was no way of considering how to do that at all. That prohibition reflected a technical judgment, not an ethical evaluation. So nobody was arguing that it should be done. This, in effect, obviates anything that was said before the moment in which it becomes technically possible to do it, which is also, by the way, the moment that it is assumed that it is inevitable that it will be done. So it's inevitable. There's no way to stop it, only to regulate it as best as possible. The questions that apply, the questions about what should be done become profoundly narrowly circumscribed because they are sort of subsidiary to a techno-scientific environment that has come into being and the inevitable future that it portends. Okay, I said inevitability is a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is what this story is about. So when the prophecy was fulfilled, the overwhelming response from the international scientific community was to declare it profoundly deviant. A scientist had gone rogue. The rogue label it kind of demarcates a clear boundary between responsible science and its outside. The responsible and the rogue, the community and the outlaw, the us and the them. And you can see this on the level of the individual scientist, the national community of which the individual scientist was a member, etc. I want to challenge this narrative because it doesn't actually, you don't have to look very hard to see that far from going rogue, this Chinese scientist He Jiankui was actually seeking to do the opposite. He was seeking to join the inside group to achieve kind of visibility and prestige for himself, and importantly for his country. And one of the motivations for his project was the reaction to that study on non-viable embryos that I mentioned earlier. There was a major sort of outcry from very prominent, very high-level accomplished figures against, a very young, up-and-coming Chinese scientist. And it in effect, at least for a while, sort of destroyed the career and reputation of that scientist. And He saw this as a kind of active racism, an active nationalistic anti-Chinese racism. Let me pause and say that most of what I'm talking about in this section comes from a series of conversations that I had with He, these sort of extended interviews between the period when his story came out in late November 2015 and he was incarcerated by Chinese authorities at the end of January 2019. So this is his sort of direct account. So He saw, with this reaction against the Chinese scientist, in 2015, whose name is Wang Junzhu, he saw a sort of reaction against Chinese science as such, the notion that these bad things are going to be done by the bad country and the bad scientists who are in the country. And it particularly incensed him when less than a year and a half later, a scientist based in the US at Oregon Health and Science University undertook an experiment that was arguably much, much more controversial, creating from scratch viable human embryos in which he also attempted to repair a disease-causing gene for the purposes of, in effect, perfecting the technique for reproduction. So no babies were produced, but upwards of the experiment, the paper says something like 120 embryos. It actually turns out that it was thousands of embryos that were created for purposes of that particular research, human embryos. But far from being marked as a rogue or an outlaw, he was celebrated. It was a Nature paper. He was featured on the homepage of his university, had a sort of exclusive spot on National Public Radio and other media, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing to appreciate is that He's approach and sort of identity is a sort of product of American technoscience. So he was a graduate student at Rice, then he was a postdoc at Stanford. Stanford, of course, is embedded in Silicon Valley, and kind of techno-entrepreneurialism is in the lifeblood of that institution, and postdocs in the fields that He was a member of get training in that sort of entrepreneurial dimension of science and technology. He was then recruited to a new university, a relatively new university in China based in Shenzhen, which is the sort of tech hub of China. It was a totally different kind of university than most other Chinese universities, in the sense that it was started from the sort of bottom up. It was funded by the city in a lot of respects, and it was built to be a sort of entrepreneurial tech transfer institution. It was intended to be the Stanford of Shenzhen. Initially, it was called the Caltech of China, and then it became called the Stanford of China. Okay, He was the star of this institution. Upon arrival, he quickly sought out laboratory space, and within a few years had established a highly successful biotechnology company, a genome sequencing company, using the intellectual property from Stephen Quake, his Stanford postdoctoral mentor, whose spin-off company using this technology had failed in the US. So this was a very unusual thing to do, rather than basically pirate intellectual property, to instead license it and produce a kind of internationally legitimate biotechnology startup. This was a sort of remarkable thing to do. And he had done it by the time he was 33. This is an image from Nature Biotechnology in, it's either 2015 or 2016. So, he had a kind of, it was on the radar of international biotechnology already. Here's John Kerry, former Secretary of State, visiting He's company, Direct Genomics, in 2018, in early 2018, some months before the CRISPR baby stories broke, but when the project was already underway. So this is the sort of standing of this figure in the sort of Chinese entrepreneurial biotech world. And in a sense, by the time he, had started actually 2 quite successful companies, he sort of felt like he'd been there and done that, and he wanted to do something of significance for his country. He wanted to go take it to the next level. And indeed, there was a warrant for this. This is a quite important speech made by Xi Jinping in 2016, calling upon innovators to take hold of science, sort of break free, because it's necessary for the progress of the nation and its standing in the international world. We cannot wait and see. We cannot blindly follow where others are leading. We must seize every minute. Time waits for no man. For what it's worth, these sorts of speeches are often sort of parsed for their policy implications. They are taken as sort of tacit expressions of endorsements from the top of the sorts of activities that are appropriate to take from the bottom, what sort of gives you cover, in effect. But the model that He looked to was not a Chinese model. It was the sort of, he sought to make himself in the image of internationally valorized scientific figures, Western scientific figures. So take note that the babies born in China were not the first babies born through novel technological means, undertaken in secret, revealed to the world just around the time of their birth, revealed in the media rather than through a traditional scientific outlet, etc. That first, of course, goes to Louise Brown, the first baby born through IVF at the hands of Robert Edwards and Patrick Steptoe in the late 1970s. And He looked specifically to Robert Edwards. Here's a quote from him. Robert Edwards' experience gave me courage. He was strongly condemned. It elicited a major international reaction, right? Mostly condemnatory. And yet it was only a couple of decades later that this innovator was given the highest award that science has to give, namely the Nobel Prize. The quote at the bottom is from a kind of self-accounting that He wrote for the authorities, the Chinese authorities that conducted the investigation on his project. I expect that after the publication of my work, it will also cause strong opposition and criticism, but I am mentally prepared. I firmly believe that what I am doing is to promote the progress of human civilization. History will stand on my side. Why? Because history always stands on the side of those innovative pioneers who push past stale norms into new territories, opening up new futures, and eventually society catches up. So I met He in a small meeting that was convened at the Innovative Genomics Institute, which is Jennifer Doudna's institute at UC Berkeley in January of 2017. This was a convening, I was like a very, very junior individual in this scene. It was like the luminaries in the field and in some nearby fields, a closed door meeting of about 20 people. And it just so happened that He was in town, and Jennifer Doudna thought it would be, good to have somebody who is, doing some work of a controversial sort in the room. And so she invited him. And he was mostly quiet during that meeting, but there was a moment in the meeting that in our conversations later, he pointed to as formative for him. And here's what he said. He said, in that meeting, a very senior scientist, and this is like as senior as you can get, okay? A very senior scientist said, many major breakthroughs are driven by one or a couple of scientists. Cowboy science. That strongly influenced me. You need a person to break the glass. I remember this moment as well, because I also wrote down that statement. This was a kind of moment of narration by a highly accomplished figure of how science and technology progresses, right? Cowboy science. From science to technology to society. Take note that this narrative is played out everywhere in ways that are so mundane and so cliched that we tend not to hear them. Technology is racing ahead so fast, society has such a hard time catching up. This is Marcia McNutt, the president of the National Academies of Sciences, making sort of off-the-cuff comments at the release of that February 2017 National Academies report on genome editing. As is always the case, the speed at which the science is advancing outpaces society's ability to grasp its implications. Here's He again. If we're waiting for society to reach a consensus, it's never going to happen. But once one or a couple of scientists make the first kid, it's safe, it's healthy, then the entire society, including science, ethics, and law, will be accelerated, will speed up and make new rules. Because after all, science races ahead and society and law and etc. lag behind. So I break the glass. So I think it's imperative that we see this rogue act as situated within a narrative of how scientific and technological progress happen, and what warrants, what authorizations are in effect given to singular actors to sort of push the boundaries in the name of bringing about those forms of progress, okay? And the sort of dissonance between this and the way the community has reacted to this case are instructive. Because, as I noted earlier, part of what preserves this narrative and the kind of authorization that it provides is the externalization of what's seen as failure, going rogue. So after little bits and pieces started to trickle out about people who maybe knew a little something about He's activities, that maybe he wasn't keeping a lid on this, it wasn't done exactly in secret and so forth. This question has arisen: how to stop these rogue actors. And this is sort of based on the notion that there were a few people who knew about it, who should have spoken up, but failed to do so. The International Commission, which is a sort of at least nominally international body that was supposed to advise on governance of genome editing, a few months ago issued a report. One of the important pieces of that report is the idea that there needs to be some kind of whistleblowing mechanism. The problem here was that the people who knew, and in effect knew that it was wrong, should have, they would have told on him had there been a way to tell on them. The World Health Organization's draft report on international governance also foregrounds this as a kind of essential mechanism. But that presumes that there is a sort of existing consensus and total clarity on what's good and bad. And yet the He case completely belies this. So this is a graphic representation of my tally of the people who were in the know about this experiment. Green is full knowledge, strongly affirmative. Yellow is, in most cases, full or nearly full knowledge, some quibbles, like, I'm not sure you picked the best genetic target, but in general, I'm good with it. And red were strongly opposed. Red is 4 people. So you can see the proportion here. This is the total is a little bit north of 60, okay? And I'm talking about pretty major figures in international science, in venture capital, in the biotechnology industry, and also public officials in China, okay? So this is not a story of a rogue action undertaken in secret, where the problem was simply the secrecy of it. This is a story of background, backstage, private spaces, coffee break, affirmation of a project that the world is not yet ready for, and therefore has to be marked as unacceptable, as prohibited in public space. But in private, when we are speaking amongst ourselves, we in the scientific guild can say, yes, this is the future. Indeed, this future is inevitable. And there's something to owning it. So one of the people that He had, that He kind of consulted with and ultimately actually joined forces with, was a quite significant figure in American reproductive medicine named John Zhang. He runs one of the biggest clinics in the country. It's in New York City. And he is a Cambridge trained, he was Cambridge trained embryologist. Zhang, He reported to me, told him, don't worry about the ethics. In 5 years, 10 years, everything will change. This is from a guy who's a sort of veteran working at the frontiers of reproductive medicine, who, in a sense has the experience and expertise to say, how long it takes for something that is seen as controversial in moment A to go to routine and widely accepted and indeed endorsed as good in moment B, okay? So this is John Zhang, who runs the New Hope Fertility Clinic in New York City. You may have encountered Zhang before when he produced the first baby through a technique called so-called mitochondrial replacement therapy. It's basically a oocyte reconstruction to ostensibly treat mitochondrial disease. He produced those embryos in New York City and then took them to his satellite clinic in Mexico, and in explaining why he did this. This was to serve a couple who I believe was from Jordan. In explaining why he did this, he said, well, you go where there are no rules because to save lives is the ethical thing to do. He has this kind of international network of clinics, in a sense, to serve this purpose, to escape jurisdiction so that he can do what's right. Even if some of his offices are in jurisdictions that have old-fashioned and outmoded law that has not yet caught up with the science. Okay. So He and Jiang met each other in the summer of 2018 and quickly saw an opportunity for a strong partnership. Jiang is originally Chinese. He wanted to sort of set up a presence in China. They traveled together in August and then in October again to Hainan province, where there is a special medical tourism campus called Boao, that is a sort of major initiative of Hainan, with very strong support from Beijing, that is basically creating a sort of big medical industrial complex that is outside the jurisdiction, by design, is outside the jurisdiction of Chinese regulatory authorities. Basically, the idea is that you can draw upon regulatory authorization elsewhere, you can negotiate regulatory authorization locally in this, in effect, lawless zone. It's not a lawless zone. It's a zone in which the law, which lags behind the state of science and technology, is lifted such that science and technology are unencumbered from recalcitrant and outmoded law, and innovation can be set free. This is the sort of idea, right? So they went to this province, they went to this locale to explore setting up a clinic. They agreed that they would, they looked at space basically, and they agreed that this is where they would set up shop. They met with the Hainan provincial authorities, and the authorities asked them in that meeting, what do you need? Do you need money? Do you need land? Land is a quite valuable commodity. That was a big offer. And they said, no, we don't need those things. What we need is permission. And they said, these are the people who you will work with on making sure that the law accommodates what you want to do. So the sort of offer of self-regulation was the most significant and desirable asset to them, and that was sort of what sold them on the place. This is a picture that I took from an upper floor of one of the hospitals in this Boao medical campus. I was there. Let's see if I can figure this out. This was January 9th, 2020. So I flew to China about 2 days after I heard of this strange new pneumonia emerging in Wuhan. So this was the last place I went before life shifted entirely to Zoom. This is on the top of a very large hospital that is a sort of marriage of traditional Chinese medicine with stem cell therapy and genomics. And my guide here, who's this woman on the side, repeated about every 10 minutes that this hospital was built in less than 9 months, moving exceedingly fast to build massive infrastructures that can do many, many things. And I think by this point, it had served something like 500,000 customers, right? So doing things at scale, this is what this place is about. And it's about pulling out ahead of the rest of the world, becoming a kind of a destination. What was it that was attractive to the Hainan authorities about this pair? Well, they were doing cutting edge and exciting work, but because it was the sort of joining forces of two accomplished figures in their respective domains, it was going to put this medical campus on the map, because they promised to hold an international conference every year in which, the leading experts in the domain of sort of genomics meets reproductive medicine would gather, at the beach resorts in Hainan and conduct their business. It was about prestige. It was about being at the center, not at the periphery, let alone an outlaw in relation to establishment science. Okay, can't stop progress. So the news of He's experiment came out actually by accident. I mean, it was not by his own design. On the Monday evening of the week in which the second international summit was taking place in Hong Kong, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. He spoke on Wednesday. I'm sure you've all seen pictures or saw this reported. He spoke on Wednesday. Less than 24 hours after he spoke, the organizing committee of that summit, which included major figures from, you know, the U.S. national academies and other international scientific or national scientific institutions, basically declared that it was time for the rest of us to follow in He's footsteps. They first condemned his project as rogue, as totally unauthorized, but then went on to say that the organizing committee concludes that the scientific understanding and technical requirements for clinical practice remain too uncertain, the risks too great to permit clinical trials at this time, but it is time to define a rigorous, responsible translational pathway towards such trials. In other words, the time for talking about whether this should be done has now passed because it has been done. And so the next phase is to ask how it should be done responsibly. The question of whether it's responsible to do it is out the window because it's been done, it's inevitable, or rather it was inevitable. And now the responsible thing to do is to follow suit. This is less than 24 hours after He spoke. I mean, it's almost a complete reversal, very similar to the reversal of that 2017 committee that abandons the kind of categorical prohibition. What's the rationale? This is from the president of the US National Academy of Science, National Academy of Medicine, and the Chinese Academy of Science. It's apparent that the ability to use CRISPR to edit the human genome has outpaced nascent efforts by the scientific and medical communities to confront the complex and ethical and governance issues that they raise. Science raises the issues, ethics responds to the issues, science races ahead, ethics and law lag behind, science has raced ahead, ethics and law have been left in the dust. This case highlights the urgent need to accelerate efforts to reach international agreement upon more specific criteria and standards. The urgent need to accelerate efforts to basically set criteria for standards and certification of authorization of the unauthorized act. So note that this has not been the kind of univocal position taken by leading figures in the scientific community. There has been some pushback. This is maybe the most notable instance of it. A call for a 5-year moratorium on any applications of heritable genome editing for any reasons, no matter what, by Eric Lander, who is a quite prominent geneticist in the US, who was yesterday appointed to a cabinet level position in the Biden administration as the US science advisor, and a number of others, including Emmanuel Charpentier, who shared the Nobel Prize with Jennifer Doudna. So they called for a moratorium. And you know, this is not black letter law. This is a pause, right? And the rationale for the moratorium is it gives us some time to figure things out. Figure out whether and how to move forward. Here's a reaction, a sampling of reactions from some influential voices in response to this proposal for a moratorium. Remember that these voices have also, since 2015, said that it now is not the time. Heritable genome editing should not proceed at this time. And yet they have very vigorously resisted the use of the term moratorium, even if it's, in a sense, functionally what they've called for. And here's a kind of, this drew to the surface what that was all about. This is David Baltimore again. With a science that's moving forward as rapidly as this science is, you want to be able to adapt to new discoveries, new opportunities, and new understandings. To make rules is probably not a good idea. So this is about preserving the freedom of science. That's the sort of imperative above all else. The imperative that in effect makes what was yesterday unthinkable, inevitable tomorrow. This is the preservation of a situation in which law and ethics inevitably lag behind because they shall not speak until the moment at which they need to react. And at the moment at which they need to react, it's in effect already too late to speak. Don't make new rules. Allow scientific flexibility. So the question then becomes not what future shall we have, but when shall we have it? And when will, and most importantly, when will society be ready to accept it? This is the story of lag captured in the sort of tacit imaginary that's embedded in this headline. The story of that linear transition. Society lags behind. When will society be ready? When will the world be ready? Here's Jennifer Doudna. In the year, who has been one of the people who's been most worried about the application of her technique to the human germline. In the year since He's announcement, some scientists have called for a global but temporary moratorium on heritable human genome editing. However, I believe that moratoria are no longer strong enough countermeasures. They're no longer strong enough countermeasures. And instead, okay, because it's inevitable, and instead, stakeholders must engage in thoughtfully crafting regulations of the technology without stifling it. It shall proceed. All we can do is regulate it. All we can do is get law to catch up with it. Okay. Last one, make people better. So this is, by the way, an image from He's lab of one of the embryos that was used in the study of a micromanipulation of one of the embryos that was used in his study. So in the summer of, I believe it was the summer of 2017, visited, he was part of a conference at Cold Spring Harbor, where James Watson, of course, was hanging around, still before his sort of fall from grace. And during the coffee break, in the meeting, He spotted Watson and accosted him. I mean, this just towering figure in molecular biology, one of the heroes, and asked him two questions. He is from a kind of country province. He has a quite heavy accent, so that native Mandarin speakers have sometimes a hard time understanding him, and so too for people who speak English. And so Watson, a little bit hard of hearing, couldn't kind of quite make sense of what He was saying, and so asked him to write down his questions. So He wrote down his questions on a piece of paper. When you discovered the structure of DNA, did you imagine that we would one day alter it? Watson answered yes. Do you think we should alter human DNA? Watson's answer was, do you think we should alter the human germline? Watson's answer was, make people better. So I think that's a wonderful phrase, make people better, because the ambiguity about what better means is quite profound. Is this better in the sort of sense of a medicine that heals the sick? Well, of course, in this case, this patient in the dish here was brought into being in the moment that the therapy was applied to it. In fact, it was brought into me for the purposes of being treated, you might say. And so to call this a treatment is a pretty strange claim, right? So, and furthermore, the better is quite an open space for imaginations of disease, disorder, health, and well-being that certainly don't limit themselves to, dread disease. This is, and I think that He's experiment is exemplary of this. So He modified a T cell receptor, a gene called CCR5, that is implicated in AIDS. That T cell receptor is the pathway through which HIV enters into and infects T cells, okay? And so by modifying that T cell receptor, in effect, at least in theory, rendered those kids, or the one kid that was a homozygote for it, immune to HIV. The kind of criterion for participation in this study was that the couple would be A, infertile, and B, that the male member of the couple was HIV positive, but on antiretrovirals. So it's very easy to avoid transmission of HIV, particularly through sperm, right? Sperm washing is this very simple, straightforward technique that's used to avoid transmission in fertilization. So there was no sort of technical barrier to having a child and making sure that that child was not infected with HIV. In China, being HIV positive is a profoundly stigmatized status, okay? So actually, people who are HIV positive are not allowed to access reproductive therapies. There's a booming business in Thailand, or at least there was up until last February, for HIV positive people who can afford it, who leave China and get their IVF taken care of there, because it's illegal in effect to provide HIV positive people with IVF in China. It's a kind of eugenic policy, okay? So it's a profoundly stigmatized condition. So this is a statement that comes from a letter written by one of the couples who participated in this study that was explaining to authorities, was sort of challenging the notion that they were somehow coerced into the experiment, that they entered it unwittingly. As an AIDS sufferer and family member, we firmly and deeply know that it's possible to use a preventative measure to have a healthy child. That drug can cure disease, but it cannot cure prejudice, okay? So what this genetic intervention was about was making these children immune to HIV, but also immune to the stigma of HIV. Because if they couldn't contract HIV, they couldn't be sort of infected by association. One of the things that He did in working up to his experiment was visit a village in which, because of some issues with blood transfusion in the past, there's a very high incidence of HIV. And the children in that village have to go to their own school because the nearby town won't allow them to attend that school. Simply having parents who are HIV positive is enough to make those children pariahs. So they have to kind of keep to their own space. And He saw this as, you know, a sort of terrible social condition that he could fix through a genetic intervention. So for anyone who is listening, please hear this. At a certain level, our participation in the experiment was indeed forced, but we weren't coerced by any person in particular. We were coerced by society. This was a genetic fix to a social problem, a profound social problem, right? Make people better. So what is this technology for? This is a question that remarkably has almost not been asked in the context of this debate. The question has been, is this technology permissible? What can we use it for? What should we use it for? What will it be used for? How can we regulate it when it's used that way? But to ask, what is this technology for? I mean, this question hasn't been asked, or I might expand that question a little bit to ask it this way. To what vision of human need, purpose, benefit, and good is this technology the right response? With what problem do you begin where it leads you to this technology as the solution? This is a technology, or rather a debate about technology, that is a solution in search of a problem. And much of the deliberation has been about that. Let me say one sort of last thing here about the sort of ideas of progress that stand beneath this. So I've talked about the sort of notion of inevitability, a sort of narrative of the relations, and indeed the right relations, between science, technology, and society and its institutions of governance, and the ways in which this constructs, or you might say constricts, the forms of deliberation that are permissible, the moments at which it's permissible, the range of questions that are asked and must be asked, and so forth. But back of this, there is a vision, not just a sort of negative vision, but a positive vision of progress. And I think that this is quite interesting. He was, in a sense, a blank slate. I mean, he wanted to be the entrepreneurial scientist. He was trained to be at Stanford. He wanted to be the Nobel laureate. He wanted to sort of have the CV of the great scientific hero, right? And he sought to make himself in the image of the people who had gone before. And in this sort of vision of progress, you might say in his theology, he also was absorbing ambient things that are floating around in his community. And those ambient things envision a world which is fundamentally transformed by technology, a world in which the human is fundamentally transformed by technology, and a kind of imperative to transform the human because of the rapid pace of technological change. And the sort of narrator of this future, one of the most prominent narrators of this future, is Yuval Harari, of whom He was quite a big fan. And He, when he was thinking about what was the sort of place of his project in the sweep of civilization, would talk about Harari and talk about the way in which technological evolution is outpacing human evolution, and the imperative of bringing those into alignment, the imperative of a kind of a directed evolution, and the role that a figure like he and others like him would play in this, you know, savior role. It's a salvational role. It's a messianic role vis-a-vis the human future. So there's a kind of secular transcendence at work here that masquerades as a pure prediction of what the laws of progress have in store for us and what imperatives of action they thereby impose upon us. So what's at stake? What's at stake is not just the technological future, but the human future. And not just the human future as a site of technological intervention, but the human future as a focus of imagination, of the kind of constructions of what human future we will have, that become constructions of the future we shall have, and become constructions of the imperatives for certain kinds of actors who are ostensibly the leading edge in those futures, the one or a couple of scientists who bring the future about, imperatives of action that they must take in the sort of name of the human future. So these are not narrow questions about the governance of a technology. These are sort of constitutive, and you might even say constitutional vocabularies about what is the human, what is essential to the human, what is right and good in human life, and indeed for the institutions that we construct to govern our own present and future. And indeed, at stake there is the ability to speak itself, the kinds of vocabularies that we use, and the authorizations to speak, or the ways in which those authorizations produce silences elsewhere. Nobody's, as remember the quote that, you know, nobody was talking about how this should be done because there was no way to do it. It's not true. It's simply not true. But what was said didn't count because there was no way to do it. And so it could be dismissed as irrelevant, as science fiction, etc. These give rise not just to sort of technological projects and futures, but to apparently natural, or rather naturalized, sovereignties. Where does the sovereign authority to speak and to act lie? And of course, most fundamentally, what's at stake are horizons of moral imagination and governance, horizons of democratic moral imagination and governance, horizons that delimit who is the we that will speak. Now we must face the questions that arise. We have a heavy burden to bear on behalf of society. We shall decide what the future of these technologies hold, etc. So let me leave you with this kind of provocation. And here's where I want to pull back from this particular story to invite us to see the kind of dynamics of authority that I've laid out through this story as much more present and pervasive in all sorts of domains at that complex nexus of science, technology, and society. And that's this, that self-governing science is sovereign science, that much of what this story is about is the cultivation of sovereignty, the kind of political project of a science that cultivates a sort of sovereignty. And He Jiankui, that the CRISPR babies are a direct expression of that scientific sovereignty, not a kind of outlaw, an outlaw who departed from its fold and its norms. So it is self-governing science that is the rogue science. It is responsible science that is the rogue science, in the sense that it constructs its responsibility as the basis of its sovereignty, and of course the other way around, and in effect authorizes things that it then externalizes as somehow antithetical to itself. This is back to those constitutive and constitutional vocabularies. Hannah Arendt, who's one of my favorite thinkers of the 20th century, wrote in the first few pages of The Human Condition about human genetic engineering. Actually, the three things she wrote about were the colonization of space, the transformation of labor through automation, and the transformation of human life through biotechnology. This is in 1958, right? And in worrying over these technological projects, she noted that one of their sort of threats to the human condition is that they, in privileging how to, kind of attenuate the capacity to know what. They render us unable to understand, that is to think and speak about the things which nevertheless we are able to do. And that those technological projects have the effect of being about the attenuation of politics, which is of course central and core to being human. And so what I've tried to show in this story, taking Arendt as a sort of springboard almost, is to show how that is brought about. How is it that the inability to think and to speak is cultivated in the imaginaries that are deployed to authorize the kind of regimes of science and technology that we have and that inhabit our world and increasingly us. I'm not going to say anything about this because I've used up enough time, but my effort to do something about this is in a kind of emerging project, which if anybody's interested, take a look. But this is a kind of heterodox project focused on taking a kind of different approach to international deliberation and governance around biotechnology, since what I've just described are the dynamics that in effect dominate that space. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was spectacular. Really appreciate it. There is time for questions. I suppose you should stop sharing the.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. There we go.
Which people can indicate in the chat, or can indicate to me, or can raise your digital hands, or whatever. Though I don't see everybody. That is true.
I have a question. Indeed, this is dramatic development, but it is just because this is 2021 now. In fact, may I ask, I don't want to sound cynical, but what is the big deal with genome editing? Why it is not considered as just another stage of medicine? I mean, in the Middle Ages, people were executed, were burned on the stake because they are there to develop medicine or intervene in what the God's decision to take this person, and you are trying to cure him. Don't we simply think that this is like any medical advance which should be regulated in order to prevent the unnecessary, the negative consequences of abusing this technology for whatever other diabolic purposes, or serve the interest of, I don't know, organizations? Why not governments are taking the reins on this technology and dictate, and of course, attach regulation and legal constraints, and keep this inevitable technology to move on for the benefit of humanity?
Okay. Well, I give a couple of answers to that. First of all, despite the fact that it's sort of characterized otherwise, actually many countries in the world long ago prohibited interventions in the human germline. Okay, there's a piece in CRISPR Journal a couple of months ago by Marcy Darnowski and Francoise Baylis that has sort of surveyed this. And one of the things that's quite interesting in the international discussion is how those jurisdictions that have placed limits are sort of downplayed or almost written out of the picture, as though they are sort of retrograde places that have taken themselves out of the running for the future. And what they've said sort of doesn't matter, because after all, they said it before it was possible to do it. I mean, one of the major kind of collections of countries in this regard are the 29 countries that have ratified the Oviedo Convention, which is the full title, or the partial title is like Convention on Human Rights in Biomedicine. And these are mostly European countries. And it in effect stipulates that there's a human right not to be genetically engineered. That's been in effect since 1997. So that's one answer. That's one answer, is that there's judgments have actually already been taken about this, and they don't push in the direction that you're suggesting they should push, namely treating this as, yet another phase of medicine, and you regulate it for its appropriate use. They have declared that its use is inappropriate, full stop. But I want to sort of pull back a little bit further and point to how much of, I need not tell this audience, right, that much of what unfolds and has unfolded in the history of medicine and the history of science and so forth, particularly where it's not the internal to the esoteric spaces of science and medicine, but is sort of embedded within a larger social order, has been profoundly contingent, could of course in millions of moments been otherwise, and yet generally tends to be narrated in the sort of idiom of progress, the stages of development, right? And I think it puts us in a dangerous position to allow ourselves to be governed by those narratives as opposed to govern them. Because you don't have to look very far in the history of medicine to discover a stage of medicine which, presented itself as progressive, as the next stage that was, a profound, went down a trajectory that is profoundly objectionable, right? I mean, this is maybe the ultimate example, but the project of the Holocaust was a public health project, right? I mean, it was undertaken in the name of medical progress. And if one in a kind of a priori mode truncates the kinds of questions that one can ask of undertakings of that sort, the horrors that will flow from those undertakings are likely to be profound. Indeed, history has borne that out over and over and over again. Okay, so then what's the big deal about genome editing? Well, I mean, I think the direct modification of the genetic profile of a person who does not yet exist is a pretty profound intervention in that person, right? So I personally think that is a significant thing. I personally think that that's a significant thing, but it's not the only reason to take this technology as a particularly significant focal point. It's because the human, materially, biomedically, but also in a sense conceptually, and therefore constitutionally, institutionally, constitutionally, normatively, discursively is at stake in this technology. Because what we make in the moments that we develop these technologies and we develop the frameworks in which they get deployed or not, are the frameworks in which they get deployed or not, right? The technological futures that we imagine, if those become the frame through which we ask questions about how we should govern ourselves, and indeed in effect ask questions about who we are such that we need to be governed, if we lose track of that, then the human comes to be transformed in ways that we're not reflective about. And it is a democratic responsibility where we, in effect, through our democratic institutions, are the custodians of the human, of human integrity, rights, and dignity. It is an imperative to see, recognize, and contend with that. One of the reasons that I have used this term sovereignty is because, in law, in political theory, sovereignty is a sort of a known figure. It's a sort of posited fiction that we all live by, right? But in the domain of science and technology, where science and technology govern our lives as profoundly as law does, and yet we don't imagine science and technology as engaging in a kind of a legislative project. We understand it as unfolding according to a natural course of development. which we can only sort of react to or be impacted upon by, we in effect cede sovereignty to authorities that are not accountable to democracy, right? There are no mechanisms for democratic correction when there's a sort of declaration that democracy ought not tread on this virgin territory, right? That this is beyond politics. And I think that it's a dereliction of democratic responsibility to allow that territory to exist beyond the reach of politics.
Thank you. Ari Schick, whom I don't know, but has her hand raised.
Thank you. I'm just there's a parallel story that you didn't have time, I think, to explore. I wonder if you could touch on briefly, which is that, as you mentioned, when the RAC committee was looking at the future possibilities of something you didn't have to discuss yet, but there was a profound change in the discourse at the beginning of the Human Genome Project with the advent of ELSI, and the idea that we actually could anticipate the coming technologies. So on the one hand, there was this noble desire for ethics to get ahead of the technological curve. On the other hand, to do so, it had to imbibe the idea of inevitability itself in order to give itself warrant to explore that future. And so in parallel to the scientific discourse giving itself warrant was the bioethical discourse, which was reaffirming it in many ways at the same time as it was trying to kind of anticipatorily regulate that future.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. It's yet another site in which you can see these dynamics at play, in which these dynamics have been, in a sense, occluded from these spaces which are filled with pretty smart people thinking about pretty important things, not least because the very existence of those people, the fact that there are salary lines to support their work or whatever, is sort of predicated on this narrative. So, I mean, the Human Genome, you're exactly right. The Human Genome Project comes into being. Remember, by the way, that the idea of initially 3% and 5% dedicated to ethical, legal, and social issues was the brainchild of James Watson. He reported later that he invented that sort of on the spot in the moment because he thought that if he didn't do that, he would be called a, quote, closet eugenicist, which of course he turned out to be, and not really closet. That was the function, that kind of cover, sort of cynically for Watson. I mean, that kind of cover was the function of the ELSI program. I'm not saying that that's what the ELSI program did, but the ELSI program was structured according to that diagram that I gave, science to technology to society, right? I mean, there was initially a sort of effort within the ELSI program to think about, well, should we have a Human Genome Project, and what should the scope be, and what sorts of questions should inform it, and et cetera, et cetera. No, that was quickly shut down, and it became about the ethical, ethical, legal, and social implications, i.e. downstream effects, a kind of consequentialist frame of the things which would be produced by the Human Genome Project. And so ethics, the scale up of bioethics under the ELSI program was the scale up of a reactive bioethics, because that was basically the framework in which you could do ethics for the Human Genome Project. So I think it's exactly right. It's like those questions got pushed to the side in order to make room for undertakings that presented themselves as intrinsically progressive, and then increasingly as intrinsically inevitable, and built constructed, didn't just sort of allow, but constructed a kind of reactive ethics to go along with them.
I wanted to say, apropos of that, first of all, there's a fellow here working in STS, an old Galison student from Harvard named Yaakov Garb, who wrote a very interesting article in a completely different context in the journal Science and Context called "Constructing Inevitability," where he tries to follow inevitability, or describe the creation of the kind of inevitability you're talking about. His is in a large-scale technological project, the Trans-Israel Highway. But he follows how there is a kind of conscious and very well organized and well choreographed effort to create this inevitability. It doesn't just rely on the kind of ambient cultural sense that these things are inevitable, but that there's a whole structure to support and to continually recreate that image in every particular context, which might be interesting to you. But my question for you, because I, just like Hannah Arendt predicted, am unable to think and speak about things that nevertheless we are capable of doing. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about your very last slide and what you and Sheila Jasanoff are doing, because I have to admit, it's embarrassing, but I don't know if I have the imagination immediately to understand how this ought to be done, how this could be done differently and ought to be done differently. And so I'd be very eager to hear a little bit about that.
So, okay, sure. So there are a few things that we've published about the Global Observatory Project. It's been like very positively received, and yet it's taken quite a bit of effort to get anybody to fund it. So we're just only actually relatively recently kind of getting a set of activities, a structure off the ground. But the idea came out of a meeting that we convened at Harvard, a sort of anti-international summit meeting, in which we did something which is totally unconventional for meetings on sort of ethics of biotechnology X. Yet kind of surprisingly it's unconventional. And that is, we didn't begin with the technology. We didn't begin with the panel of the scientists who give us a lesson on the science and lesson on the technology, and then the ethicists who come in and say what's at stake with it, and then the policy people and law people who come in and say what's the state of play, and et cetera, and then the other stakeholders and so forth, which of course recapitulates the sort of linear model that I was describing. We instead began with a panel that focused on essentially constitutional traditions that contend with the integrity of the human. I mean, what is the human that warrants protection in these different political imaginations that have been codified and have traditions built around them? And we ended up with a very different conversation, one that could not so straightforwardly and easily occlude the things that are happening and being thought in a diverse set of societies and cultures. And one of the ideas that came out of that meeting is a sort of sense that this was a very unconventional conversation and put things on the table that are essential and yet would be ephemeral without a kind of infrastructure for sustaining it. And I mean, it makes sense, right? The scientific academies are a very powerful infrastructure for sustaining a particular, I mean, as you were pointing out, I don't know this article, I'll look it up right away, but I absolutely agree that that work goes into the making of these sort of narratives or imaginaries, but they're imaginaries because they come to be codified in practice, in institutionalized practice, that therefore have a durability. They're done, they're enacted, and work goes into the enacting of them. And part of that is simply having, the national academies say they stepped up because there was no one else to step up, but there's a sense in which that territory is occupied by virtue of the fact that there's sort of well-resourced, prestigious scientific academies that then construct their own stage on which they rehearse these things, and everybody falls into place. So what we are trying to do is to bring to the surface, make visible the range of thinking that exists. It's on genome editing, but if you begin with that starting point, the human, the ways in which duties, obligations, etc., to the human are codified in political formations, it's not about genome editing. It's about governance as such, and the intersection of science, technology, and governance. So the project is to sort of render visible the diversity of approaches that are taken in that domain, because there's a remarkable occlusion of them, to not just sort of look at like what's the law on the books here versus there, but what's behind the fact that law is on the book. What's the sort of normative repertoire that is, or the constitutional repertoire that has been that has been deployed in arriving at particular policy formations, right? Or policy arrangements, and also institutional arrangements, processes of deliberation, et cetera. And most importantly, I think, to convene conversations between people who just basically wouldn't talk to each other, and thereby perturb the enclaves of reflection that are powerful, in part because they don't talk to people who are outside of them, and therefore they don't have to see and contend with orthogonal or even dissenting approaches, to bring those into conversation / confrontation, and with the hopes of, who knows what transformations might result. Maybe it will reveal the extent to which there's a kind of raw exercise of power through resources in these domains, because it's one thing to say we've considered everything that needs to be considered. It's another thing to say, well, we've chosen to just ignore these things that we now see, but choose not to consider. Maybe it will, my hope is that it will be, there are well-meaning people all the way through these spaces, and yet with limited imaginations of the sort that we all have, because we all come from our particular subject positions. And my hope is that, our hope is that there will be a kind of enriched collective sort of discourse that can emerge out of this. What forms that will take, what sort of institutional forms that might take, I don't know. We aren't in a position to predict that either, but it's one of the reasons that this is an observatory, not an advisory, because there have been dozens of reports issued by advisory committees in which virtually no, with some exceptions, virtually no effort has gone into explaining why that committee is the right committee, why those 14 people are the right people to say what the human future shall be. In some cases they are national ethics bodies authorized by the parliament or whatever. And so there's a kind of inbuilt political legitimacy, but in many cases, these are just experts who are gathered together to give advice about what should be done. And we want to ask, well, what are the questions that need to be asked? What are the questions that are not getting asked? What's happening by virtue of the fact those questions are not getting asked? What happens if we ask those questions, etc.? So hopefully that gives a sense of the effort.
One quick follow-up question. I know our time is running out, but is the fact that people aren't falling over themselves to fund this reflective of kind of Hannah Arendt attitude in the discourse in general among people who are thinking and worrying about these things?
I mean, this is a kind of unconventional thing, so there's no National Science Foundation request for proposals for this sort of thing, right? And we're in a moment in which philanthropic foundations are, for the most part, interested in getting into the solutions business, right? So Chan Zuckerberg has $1 billion to cure all disease, but essentially no money to ask what is disease anyway, or what does it mean to cure, etc. And so I think that there isn't all that much that's interesting to say about that beyond just the kind of broader cultural orientation of well-capitalized operations, what public good those vanishingly small number of extremely wealthy people who increasingly account for the inequality in our world themselves envision as a sort of contribution to the public good. And I think people recognize the value and significance of this sort of thing when you bring them into it. But to say we need to work harder at achieving a kind of Arendtian politics, particularly given that the things that need governing transcend the limits of the nation state increasingly. I mean, that doesn't, there are a lot of people who want to throw money at that, although there should be. Just in case any of the 10 richest people on earth are in this Zoom room.
Rolly, are you indicating there's time for one more question?
Yeah, can I ask?
Yes.
Okay, Ben, thank you very much. This is so fascinating. Even though you emphasized your focus here on the governance side, let me ask you if I could pull you to the other end of things and talk about if you see any place for the homebrew enthusiasts that are claiming that this is also the beginning of the, the same thing that we heard about home printing, the fourth revolution on that end, and so issues of governance might take on a different slant when you think about it as something that's a groundswell instead of funded from above.
Yeah, so absolutely. I guess what I would say in response to this, and this is a really interesting issue, is that I wouldn't be so hasty about drawing a clean demarcation between the DIYers and their homebrew projects and the establishment, right? There's a lot of movement, just even in terms of the people who are in that, back and forth across that line. And there's a sense in which there's increasingly a kind of institutionalization of the.
You mean
I'm sorry?
The same operator? You mean the same operators, same people?
Yeah. I mean, like the open source insulin project was, maybe I've got this wrong, but I think it was started by a MIT, molecular biology graduate student or something, or postdoc or something. I mean, you work in the university lab and then you cross the street and you work in the DIY lab and you carry with you the ethos that you have in the university lab and also the know-how that you have in the university lab. And I mean, the demarcations are much less clear. I think that reproductive medicine is actually a great domain to see the sort of groundswell turned institutionalized, normalized practice, because the way we in this country, in the US, sort of fostered the development of that industry was basically just to let 1,000 flowers bloom. And that industrial space has been also the space of experimental innovation, right? So what you do is you try to make a baby some new way, and then you make a baby, and then a bunch of people want to pay you to make your baby in that way. And I think the poster child for this is intracytoplasmic sperm injection, the direct injection of sperm into egg, which was an accident that produced a baby. Lo and behold, the baby was okay. And so they produced some more babies. And within like a year, this was a massive growth area in reproductive medicine. Is that like outlaw, DIY, out of the establishment, bottom up, homebrew? Well, yeah. Is it biomedical establishment, normalization comes to be a sort of figure of progress? Well, yeah. I mean, it's both of those simultaneously. And I think He is actually a quite interesting example of that mixture too. He was a very unusual figure in Chinese science, just like his university is an unusual university in Chinese science, because it's trying to capitalize on, the sort of build a multi-billion-dollar business out of your garage model, or I guess it's trillion-dollar business if you figure Apple now. That's the vision. That's the imaginary. And so, the establishment is partly about establishing those spaces in which you can go rogue kind of and make the future because you can see it better than other people can. And so I'm uncomfortable with drawing that strictly delimited demarcation. I mean, next week, one of the people who's speaking in my bioethics class is the guy who's the head of RADVAC, Rapid Something or Other Vaccine Development. He was in George Church's lab at Harvard, made this sort of separate quasi-commercial entity in which they cooked up their own homebrew COVID vaccine. And like the 100 people who have vaccinated themselves with this nasal vaccine are, many of them are sort of luminaries in the bioscience establishment. Is that
and now
homebrew?
They have superpowers.
What's that? Now they have what?
Superpowers.
Yeah, and now they have superpowers, right? Exactly. Well, I think they believed that they did from the beginning, which is why they undertook the. But anyway, you see what I mean, and I think the fluidity, what one has to pay attention to is not like what are the four walls within which this is taking place, what are the rules and regulations that govern it, where is the money coming, all those things matter, of course, but I think what matters in a sense more are the imaginaries that flow in and out of these spaces and draw them together or create sort of artificial delineations between them and ultimately come to transform. I mean, the anti-establishment has become the establishment. I mean, that is in a sense the story of Silicon Valley, right? That is the story of Homo Deus. And we better pay attention to that as opposed to, just thinking, oh, these are the guys that don't have anybody looking over their shoulder. That's worrisome, I think.
Thank you so much, Ben. This was fascinating and wonderful. This is the last moment of the semester for us, and what a great moment it was. So thank you very, very much. And thanks all the rest of you. Have a terrific semester break, and let us hear from you in the semester break, and then we'll be in touch. That beer will.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and apologies for keeping you from your vacation.
No, this is the greatest way to go into it. Thank you.
Okay. I'm also, by the way, happy to stick around in the hallway, so to speak, if anybody wants to chat further. So.
Okay, well.
Can I ask you, Ben, then, since you offered, if that's
Sure.
okay? I was
Yep.
wondering if you're thinking about any other forms of genomic interventions or manipulation rather than just gene editing, because personally, my own project has to do with bioethic issues of epigenetic interventions in fetal environments, like the developmental origin of health and disease projects. So I was wondering if you, what's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I actually think that the sort of fetal territory is an incredibly fascinating and important and likely to be quickly emergent domain, especially for the sort of interventions that you're referring to, which are temporary. I mean, epigenetic interventions that are in principle reversible, that may or may not be heritable, etc. I mean, I think there's something quite interesting about the sort of delineation of permanence versus less permanence. But given the fact that, I mean, these are really powerful tools, as you know, and one of the things that's quite remarkable is how much of the discussion that hasn't taken place around, potential for genetic, but let's say genetic, epigenetic, etc., intervention in the human has been based on the notion that, well, it's too complicated. You can't intervene in intelligence. You can't intervene in et cetera, et cetera. And that just seems to me to be false. Number one, because at the level of reproduction in particular, you can intervene in all kinds of things without actually knowing whether your intervention has been successful. You don't have a kind of null hypothesis, right? I mean, there isn't the control or whatever. And so all you have to do is look at the fertility industry to see that massive amounts of tools and interventions are sold to people that are actually known to be ineffective, and yet they are multi-million-dollar industries to sell those add-ons, basically. So for genome editing, for embryonic stage genome editing, I mean, this is very likely to be sort of in the same category because it's a cheap thing to do if you're already doing IVF, and yet it's a quite powerful thing to do. And you don't, you just believe you got a better embryo because you bought the option, you don't know what your non-edited kid would have been like, right? But also because, I mean, especially in development, as regulatory systems, as the not the gene that codes, but the gene that switches on and off, and the conditions, the circumstances under which it switches, as those come to be better understood, and they're rapidly becoming better understood. What's becoming better understood is both what they do and how extraordinarily profound a very tiny, very temporary, very targeted intervention can be in the resulting phenotype. I think that we've been putting our head in the sand about this. And if we just ask the question in terms of a given intervention and is it safe and effective and et cetera, I mean, how do you do the experiment anyway if it requires you to create people? We seem to have decided that we're good with that. You know, if we only ask those questions, it's always on a kind of a case-by-case basis, and it basically shoves to the margins the questions that I think we should be asking, the questions that were asked in that 1980 letter, but they get answered regardless of whether we ask them. You know, they get answered de facto, if not intentionally. Anyway, I mean, I think that, you know, there's a sense in which you could just substitute other nearby or even somewhat far afield technological domains for the things that I was talking about and tell roughly the same story and have roughly the same worries. So it's good to have other people worrying about those things.
Ben?
Yeah.
If I may, one like picking up on what I asked before, but also has to do with this. Given your outlook, the way you explained about the private person and the governance side, and how the lack of demarcation in the outlook, still, I would say that we can find different flavors of inevitability, or different ways of describing how it's deterministic. You could have the post-human enthusiast who's talking about hacking the DNA as a, as a preordained action of the hacker, and you can talk about a more sober appreciation of how, you know, technologies find a way to assert themselves. But my question is, like, where's your take on when you describe it as inevitable? You seem to lean towards the slower, it'll find a way to become the new standard. But in some ways that could also be said about the way that the post-humanists are talking. So basically I'm asking where you stand with regard to that.
Yeah, so I think the point is well taken. I think it's a really important point that there are sort of different flavors of inevitability. But I think that there's heterogeneity there, but there's also a kind of shared substratum that I think is worth noting. That let's just use the kind of caricatures, the bioconservative and the transhumanist or whatever may talk about technological change, the dynamics of technological change in extremely similar ways, even though the former laments them and the latter affirms them, right? And one of the things that actually got me into things in this domain was being quite fascinated with that in particular, the way that sort of transhumanist visions, and that edited volume that Noah referred to is in part about this, the way that sort of transhumanist visions will shift registers from a kind of, you know, eschatology in moment A to a just kind of technical expert description of the way in which technological change happens, how knowledge advances, that, you know, such that the sort of eschaton that was a minute ago the focus of this sort of enthusiastic vision of self-transformation is actually just a thing that will happen, that I don't have a stake in. I just happen to know about how the dynamics, the transhumanist says, I happen to know about the dynamics of how technological change happens, such that I'm in a position to say that this is where we're going, folks. I mean, Harari actually is a very good example of that kind of narrative. It's a very sophisticated but particular variety of that narrative. A different variety is Ray Kurzweil, who, you know, has his sort of law of accelerating, of exponential technology is just simply like, first you get the wheel, and then the wheel makes you go that much faster, and then you get the steam engine, and that makes you go double as fast, and then pretty soon you're like, whoosh, I don't have anything to do with it, but it's going to be awesome. I mean, that's that. And the bioconservative says, whoa, we got to kill this thing because it's shooting us up on this trajectory. I think that one has to actually step back and say, what is the formation that these two caricatured positions, which, by the way, get performed once they're caricatured? I mean, people come to identify in a particular way and speak a particular language and so forth. What is it that they're sitting inside of, such that some prophecies are being made, and what are the dynamics whereby they become self-fulfilling? It doesn't. So the implication of that is, of course, that there's sort of its contingency all the way down and its agency all the way down. And I mean, I think that that's true to a certain degree. I mean, I guess if I have a kind of normative position, it's that if we are to act responsible, we better act like we have responsibility and agency. But I mean, institutions matter. They have durability. You can't just make them go away. Capital matters. It is asymmetrically allocated where it is. It does the things that it does. I mean, there are dynamics that have force, but we are part of those dynamics. They are of our own making. Whether and how they might be unmade is a separate question and is a difficult question, but it is a question. And I think much of the time we just don't bother asking it. It's too hard, takes too much effort to figure it out. It's kind of more exciting to imagine ourselves on a runaway train and, wring our hands over what cliff we're going to go off, or celebrate whatever stratosphere we're going to get launched into. I don't know. But that's you got to see these things as inside of politics, not an exit from them, and yet they function as an exit from them, and the kind of responsibilities, the sort of Arendtian responsibilities that attach to the project of politics, just drop out of the picture. And we talk about not what we're doing, but how to do it in that sort of circumscribed frame, which is, of course, regulation. I mean, regulation is how should we do this, not what is it that we're doing.
I have one question. First of all, thank you so much for staying in for this little chat, but also for a very fascinating talk and a very clear presentation. My question is actually about kind of your thoughts about, the positive scenario when we're gonna get into some kind of governance regime. What we're gonna do with people in China? Do you think that a regime like that is going to be discussed and maybe negotiated, in the West, is going to be accepted in the East? And, while people are working there on developing this kind of, different usage of technologies? Thanks.
So it's a really good question. It's something that I've gotten quite interested in. I don't have even remotely the foundation for expertise to say much about how kind of governance has unfolded and is unfolding in China. And yet, out of my interest in this story, I have tried to dive as deep as I possibly can. And it is quite a fascinating story. And so a couple of sort of key things. The narrative of rogue has always, especially before there was a face to put to the rogue, has always been, sort of scientist, but it's just this one step away from country. Rogue nation, rogue scientist, rogue nation. I mean, these things sort of go together, and it's about the sort of idea that there's the country enables, the rogue country enables the rogue actor. But actually, if you look at the Chinese response to He's experiment, from the very second moment, the Chinese establishment vigorously attempted to align itself with international science, namely what the important people from the US National Academies, et cetera, said at the summit, when the news came out. The first response in the Chinese press, this is the state press, was affirmative. Like it was like, great Chinese achievement, great Chinese first. Then the Nobel laureates started opening their mouths. That story evaporated, and it was immediately replaced by a kind of repudiation, like even a coordinated repudiation from the Chinese scientific establishment that thought, you guys, you've screwed us. Like, we're not going to be able to play the prestige game with these other guys. We're not going to get into science and nature anymore, et cetera. And the kind of criminalization, which is itself a pretty interesting story because there was actually no criminal act. The criminalization of that act was about, taking him from rogue and turning him into criminal, convicted criminal, incarcerated criminal. He's doing time. I mean, he's in prison right now. And we took the rogue, we punished the rogue, problem solved, wash our hands of it. We're aligned with you. We are on the same side as you guys. We're on the responsible side. And that is about the kind of international alignment of science. And so it's in a sense, the norms that were taken up domestically in response to criticism internationally. And this is actually just the last episode in a fairly long effort of China to import Western bioethics, basically, to build bureaucratic processes that are recognizable, certifiable as certifying processes that are like Western processes, et cetera. I mean, all of that is about bringing it into harmonization. But what's getting brought into harmonization? So one interesting little tidbit that I haven't told you, He submitted the manuscript laying out this study to Nature magazine in early November. And so a few weeks before the summit, Nature had basically put him through the paces to produce all of the documents necessary to show that the experiment was ethical. Okay, so that's what they were worried about, ethics. And what he had to do was furnish the artifacts that the bureaucratic process that certifies the science as ethical. He had to furnish all of those artifacts, right? And he furnished all of those artifacts. And Nature was sufficiently satisfied with what he had furnished to determine that in principle it would publish this article, and it sent it out for peer review. It sent it out for peer review, if I have my dates right, like 4 days before the summit. And then as soon as there was the sort of backlash in the public sphere, once the news slipped out, it withdrew it for peer review and was completely silent about it. And I think nobody knew that Nature had even touched it until I told Antonio Regalado, and he wrote a piece on it. but that's the gatekeeper. I mean, this is the mechanism of certification. It's also the mechanism of valorization. I mean, that is prestige. I mean, having your thing in Nature is what it's all about, right? And yet Nature is playing sort of judge and jury, maybe not quite executioner, on questions of ethics, even as it is operating with this incredibly attenuated construction of ethics, which is basically just procedural, right? And so I think that these entanglements, these formations, the ways in which, yes, place, culture, et cetera, context matters, but those places are also placeless. I mean, international science's sort of aspirational placelessness is not a placelessness. It's not transcendent. It's supervenient. I mean, it floats above and around and disciplines in quite profound ways. And, it doesn't know what it's doing. I mean, Nature doesn't want to be responsible for saying what kind of science is ethical or not, but Nature is de facto, in effect, responsible for saying what kind of science is ethical or not. We're having a little conversation now, maybe a growing conversation about the potential, the plausibility, let me phrase this carefully, the thinkability, the plausibility of a laboratory origin for SARS-CoV-2 because of a very well established, tradition of gain of function research, including in coronaviruses. Why does that exist? Well, it's because the journals publish it, right? The journals, I mean, if you go back to the controversy around the H5N1 papers in 2011, which is a totally fascinating controversy and actually, interestingly, is connected to this case. That controversy was basically about whether the journals would and should publish research. In effect, was about whether the journals would make or break the careers of these researchers who were doing the research. If the journal said the door is closed on this kind of work, that work would not get done, right? Period. It would not be a source of prestige, etc. The journals open the door. Why do the journals open? Because it's exciting research and it gives the journals visibility. Everybody benefits in a certain sense, except for the fact that people are making viruses with pandemic potential in their laboratories, right? A little fun anecdote, that case, and one of the key players in that H5N1 case was in that room of 20 people in the 2017 meeting. And that was a focus of discussion. And one person, key player in it, said at one point in a kind of halting way, well, I actually don't think the experiment should have been done. And another very prominent scientist working in a completely unrelated domain was just absolutely flabbergasted by the idea that one scientist would tell another scientist that he shouldn't do an experiment, like sovereign science, right? Kind of scientific freedom, total autonomy. Scientific freedom is what it's all about. No one should say thou shalt not. And this produced a sort of heated discussion. That this was in the last session of the day. We walked to dinner. These guys argued about this. The last 10 minutes of that session, on the walk to dinner, all the way through dinner, was sort of like a 3-hour argument, and He was sitting there observing this. Like, science should not tell science what science should not be done. I mean, that's a norm, right? It's a very, very powerful norm. So it's not Chinese science, it's science with Chinese varieties that are taking shape with an aspiration to get into the game of, the international race, which is a race for technological prowess. It's a race for economic control, of course, but it's also, most importantly, I think, a race for prestige. And so, where the norms are set, that is really important. And they're not, you can't draw nice, clean national boundaries around them and say, good guys are here and bad guys are there, or this is lawful and this is lawless. It's the lawless space of science that renders itself lawful by declaring itself sovereign and self-governing, and declaring itself well-governed by treating as outside of it those who go rogue. I mean, that's law. Is it law or is it outlaw?
Thank you. I'll take a little follow-up and just ask you, in very short one, do you think that the current laws that we have to govern bioethics then are enough for this kind of new technology?
No. So I'll tell you one little story that's, I think that's a sufficient answer. I'll tell you one little very interesting story. At the 2018 summit, after He gave his talk and was grilled by two people, one of whom was Robin Lovell Badge, who I quoted from in my inevitability comments early on, okay? There was, they opened it up to public Q&A. And it was amazing. Almost all of the questions were about the informed consent process. These people couldn't really have given their informed consent, right? Because, they must have been illiterate or uneducated or poor or coerced or blah, blah, blah. It was all about how to find whatever must be the problem in the sort of procedural performance of ethics that he had engaged in, that was the smoking gun that revealed this experiment to be unethical. But, he engineered some babies. There are a lot of other ways to say that that's unethical than to say, he didn't check the right boxes on his IRB documents, right? Anyway, but that is the shared repertoire. That is what stands for ethics actually in practice. And I think we should worry about that.
Thank you so much again. This was wonderful. It's wonderful to see your face. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to that beer.
We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.